Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 15, Bahrain. So we go to our first country in the Middle East, our first Arabic country, and our first country that is definitively in Asia. A lot of the Caucasus countries I've talked about are all in this weird state of, depending on who you ask, are or are not a part of Asia. But enough of that, let's look at Bahrain. The Kingdom of Bahrain is an island country made up of a series of islands in the Persian Gulf. Nearby countries include Iran to the north of it, Qatar to the southeast, and Saudi Arabia to the west. Saudi Arabia actually is connected with Bahrain due to the King Fahd Causeway, which connects the main island of Bahrain, Bahrain Island, to the Bahraini island of an-Nisan, and then to an artificial island that acts as a border checkpoint, and finally to Saudi Arabia itself. Bahrain is mostly made up of flat deserts, fitting into a lot of stereotypes of how the Middle East looks and appears in media, although it should be noted that there are parts of Bahrain that are more green-looking, benefiting from large freshwater reserves found under Bahrain Island. Population-wise, Bahrain has around 1.6 million people living in the country, mostly found in the northern half of Bahrain Island. However, it's important to note that Bahrain and many of the Gulf states have a very strange demographic quirk. The majority of people in Bahrain are not citizens from Bahrain, with only around 45% being citizens. The rest are foreign workers and expats, mostly coming from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. South Asians often move to the country looking for work, and tend to be found working low-paying jobs or in the security forces. Other immigrant groups include Filipinos, Indonesians, Somalis, Syrians, other Gulf Arabs, British people, and Americans. Of those who are citizens, most are primarily of Arabic stock. However, it should be noted that many have either full or partial heritage from either Iran, India, or East Africa. Arabs, or Arabish people, tend to hold most of the influential jobs in the country and lead it politically. Language-wise, most citizens and political meetings will be spoken in Arabic, a Semitic language which means it's closely related to languages like Hebrew and Aramaic. However, when looking at most of the immigrant population, you'll find a whole host of languages are spoken. The second largest language is Baluchi, with Urdu, Hindu, Bengali, and Tamil all being common among this population. The language that everyone uses to communicate with each other in day-to-day life, and often for foreign business meetings, is English. Religion-wise, Islam dominates in Bahrain. Around 70% of the population is Muslim. However, Muslims in the country are divided between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, with a split being roughly 50-50. Sunni Muslims are made up of a combination of mostly poor foreign workers and the rich elite of the country. Shia Muslims tend to be made up of much of the citizenry of the country, but tend to be excluded from power. Besides Islam, Christianity and Hinduism also make up a significant chunk of the population, with 15% being Christian and 10% being Hindu, with nearly all of these being foreign workers. Bahraini history begins with the Dil Moon Civilization back in the 3000 BCE. The Dil Moon were noted for being a seafaring people, trading with many different entities in the ancient world, connecting the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia to the Indus River Valley civilization, making the Dil Moon very rich. Many different cultures would mix and blend together, with merchants from all over the ancient world trading in Dil Moon. Bahrain during this time would often be described as a paradise, having far more plant life, and there is actually some historical debate if the richness found in the country was the inspiration for the Garden of Eden written about in Abrahamic faiths. Towards the end of the 1000s BCE, the Dil Moon Civilization found itself coming under foreign occupation, but still remained an important trading port for centuries to come. Bahrain, starting in the ancient classical era, would see rule from several different Persian dynasties. The Persians who arrived often gave a more Persian character to Bahrain, and gave greater connections to the Persian world. Bahrain under Persian rule would begin to work in the pearl industry. Around Bahrain there was a large abundance of oysters, and these oysters produced some of the finest pearls in the world. Up until the 20th century, the pearl industry was the backbone of the Bahraini economy. During the Middle Ages, Bahrain would become Islamic. It was one of the first areas to convert to Islam, with much of the population converting in 628 CE. The Middle Ages would see Bahrain become Arabized, with the conversion to Islam, and several different Muslim dynasties would rule Bahrain. One of the most interesting of these would be the Cormatians. Now, to fully explain who the Cormatians are and what all the crazy ideological and religious motivations behind their rise to power would probably take hours to fully explain. So I'll try to be brief, but it'll probably be confusing. I know it certainly is for me. So the Cormatians were an Ismaili Shia Islamic group that opposed the Sunni rulers of the region. The Cormatians staged a revolt in 899, and this led to them taking much of the eastern half of Arabia, where they established a strange kind of pre-liberal republic, which apparently had many segments of society just not paying taxes, and an economy dominated by African slave labor. The Cormatians would actually sack the holy city of Mecca, taking an important Islamic relic known as the Black Stone in 931. Now the Cormatians at one point found a Persian man who they believed to be the Mahdi, or essentially a mythical savior who was supposed to end the world and lead all Muslims into a paradise. But the guy they found was actually Zoroastrian, a religion that was widely popular in Iran, and he would start preaching Zoroastrianism and actually insulted Allah, Muhammad, and just all Muslims in general. So after only 80 days of rule, he was promptly killed, damaging the legitimacy of the state, and by 1076 the Cormatians were kicked out of Bahrain. Several other Islamic polities would rule the region, including the Umayyad Emirate, the Uwasfulids, the Jarwanids, and the Jabrid Emirate. The Jabrids would be overthrown in 1521 by the Portuguese. The Portuguese during this time were in a period of their history where they were traveling all over the world to see the pretty sights and to try to gain economic control over many important trade routes throughout the world. Bahrain, being a fairly rich trade port and having a thriving economy, looked perfect for the Portuguese. They took the country after an invasion and ruled the country for around 80 years, mostly taking a hands-off approach to governance due to difficulties in transporting soldiers to the islands. After Portuguese rule, the Safavids of Iran would take control of Bahrain. Now, because I know you all listened to my Azerbaijan episode, you should know all about the Safavids. But just in case you forgot, here's a quick refresher. The Safavids were a Persian dynasty that managed to unite Iran and the Persian world, and converted much of the population to Twelver Shiaism. Bahrain had since the days of the Cormatians a decent Shia population, but Safavid rule would increase the predominance of Shiaism, with more people converting to it and Shia clerics holding much of the political power in Bahrain. The Safavids, like the Portuguese, chose to indirectly rule the country, hiring locals to carry out much of the administrative work. For the first 100 years of Safavid rule, Bahrain would prosper, but after an Omani invasion in 1717, and several years of back-and-forth conflict, much of Bahrain was depopulated. This point of time would see a lot of unrest, as different Arab tribes, local rulers, and even on occasion Europeans would try to gain footholds in the region to gain access to the lucrative trade in the Gulf. In 1753, with unrest throughout the Persian realm, Bahrain came under the rule of Nasser al-Makuru. Nasser managed to take several cities in the Persian Gulf and Bahrain, while still remaining as a puppet king to the Persian Shahs. Nasser only managed to rule for several years, as Bahrain was invaded in 1783 by a Qatar-based tribe known as the Bani Utbah. One of the clans of this tribe, the Sunni Khalifa, would manage to take control of the country, establishing a monarchy, calling themselves at first the Hakimun of Bahrain. The Khalifs would bring Sunnis to power in the country, although Sunnis remained in the minority. But while the Khalifa were in control of Bahrain, they were still fraught with danger all around them. Rival tribes would fight for control of the region, and the Persians, Omanis, and Ottomans all eyed Bahrain, hoping to take this series of islands. However, a new player entered the region, one which the Bahraini hoped they could use to establish their independence. The British Empire during the 19th century were growing throughout the world, and the Middle East looked like another great place to go and colonize. Starting in 1820, Bahrain would sign a series of treaties with Britain that recognized the Khalifs as rulers of Bahrain, but giving the British an increasing amount of control over Bahraini foreign policy. After a disastrous war between Bahrain and Qatar in 1868, Bahrain signed away its independence by making Bahrain a protectorate of the British Empire, although with the Khalifas still being given a large degree of self-autonomy. Modernization would come to Bahrain in the early 20th century, by building up the capital Manama, abolishing slavery, setting up schools in the country, starting to drill for oil in the 30s, and ominously, bringing foreign troops to police Bahraini streets and quell any unrest. Oil would change the economy for the country, as the pearl industry in Bahrain began to die off, due to the rise in the Japanese pearling industry. Oil instead would become highly valuable because, well, it's oil. It makes just about all modern machinery go. Speaking of which, a new type of modern machinery would enter the country, the battleship. The British would set up a naval base on the island to help secure their interest in the region. But despite all these changes and the ruling elites becoming fabulously wealthy, a growing discontent began to emerge in Bahrain. This wealth was concentrated in the upper crust of society, while pretty much everyone else gained nothing. Bahrain also experienced new competing ideologies that rocked much of the Arab world. Pan-Arabism, or the idea that the Arabic world should unite to throw off Western influence, became the dominant ideology among much of the intellectual class, and slowly leftist groups began to emerge in the country. In 1965, an uprising broke out in much of the country, with recently laid off petroleum workers joining leftists and students in occupying several parts of the country, before being put down by the British colonial forces. The British eventually realized that they couldn't hold on to the Persian Gulf colonies, and in 1971 left, giving independence to Bahrain. However, in many ways, things would remain the same. The Khalifas would remain in power, although they now title themselves as emirs, and did introduce briefly some limited democracy with an elected parliament, although it would quickly be dissolved in 1975. Government forces were also given legal authority to take pretty much anyone off the street and hold them for as long as they liked. Sunni Muslims in general would continue to dominate politically and economically. Even Bahrain's role as a naval base would remain. While Britain left in 1971, the US Navy arrived soon after, using it as a base to stage further military operations in the Persian Gulf. Bahrain remained a rich country, despite all the inequality and tension present in it. It slowly began the process to move away from oil production, and began turning to finance and banking. Ultimately, the country found itself living the high life, and slowly people began to immigrate to the country looking for work. While there had been a significant South Asian population in the country since British rule, starting in the late 70s, an increasingly large number of South Asians arrived looking for work. These South Asians found good-paying jobs, at least in comparison to their home countries, in much of the construction industry. Another role these new migrants would fill would be in the security forces. This ensured that if domestic unrest did erupt in the country, the Khalifas would have a force that wouldn't feel too much sympathy to those protesting. Tension in the country boiled over in 1994, with a 5-year-long series of protests against the government. The opposition in the country was made up of a very strange coalition of leftist groups, Arab nationalists, feminists, liberal constitutionalists, and Shia Islamists. I guess authoritarian regimes make strange bedfellows. All these groups were united in demanding a return to some form of parliament. The government often accused the protesters, especially the Shia protesters, of being agents of Iranian foreign policy. Iran had in 1979 a massive revolution, with a Shia theocratic republic coming into power. The Iranian government often funded Shia militant groups around the Arab world, hoping to spread Iranian influence. And throughout several points in Iran's history, Iran had claimed Bahrain as being an integral part of the country. Even today, there is some dispute as to how much Iran influences Bahrain Shia opposition, with government forces playing up the connections and arresting and eliminating several alleged militant groups. The Shia opposition tends to argue that most of these militant groups are either entirely made up or are isolated from the rest of the opposition, and the Bahraini government just likes to talk about Iran to distract from the protesters' concerns. The protests in the 90s would result in over 40 people dying. This would end in 1999, with Hamid bin Isa al-Khalifa coming to the throne. Hamid was reform-minded. In 2002, he re-established parliament, allowing both male and female citizens to vote in elections. Opposition parties were legalized, the power of the security forces were reduced, and more power was given to the Shias, and Hamid declared himself king. However, despite these reforms, many in the opposition camp were still upset. The elected parliament was mostly filled with Sunni Khalifa loyalists, and much of the political power in the country remained in the executive office, which was dominated by the royal family. Hamid's uncle, Khalifa bin Salman al-Khalifa, for example, had actually been prime minister of the country since 1970, and he wouldn't be leaving that post anytime soon. Much of the discontent of the 90s emerged again in 2011, during the Arab Spring. As revolutions toppled authoritarian governments in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, opposition members in Bahrain took to the streets protesting authoritarianism, discrimination against the Shia, and a lack of support for the unemployed in the country. Protesters started regularly meeting at a landmark in Manama known as the Pearl Roundabout. There, thousands would camp out, protesting, hoping for change in the country, and carrying out marches. One march would see around 100,000 people go out to march, in what became known as the March of Loyalty to the Martyrs. This would actually involve around 20% of all citizens in Bahrain. For some comparison, all of the George Floyd protests in the United States starting in late spring and into the summer would involve only around 12% of all Americans. But what martyrs were they marching for? Well, similar to the 90s protests, violence would be a common staple of these protests, with almost every week someone being killed in clashes. Bahraini security forces quickly earned a reputation of brutality, with tear gas and live ammo being employed liberally, and any who were arrested by the police were often tortured. The Salmani medical complex became another focal point of the conflict, as in March of that year, Bahraini forces occupied the hospital, where most of the protesters who had been injured were detained. Opposition forces also accused the government of using Sunni mobs to beat protesters or any who tried to aid them. The government in return accused the protesters of being agents for Iran and going into immigrant neighborhoods to threaten and beat suspected policemen. The protests would continue until 2014, although most of the major fighting took place in early 2011. The results of the protests were depressing. Over 100 people died, with 13 being security personnel and the remainder being protesters. Around 3,000 were arrested, 5,000 laid off their jobs, and around 1,000 had to leave the country. Many opposition groups present in the country, such as the largest political party, the El Wafd National Islamic Society, were dissolved by the government, with its leaders either arrested or forced to go underground. The Pearl Roundabout itself was destroyed by the government in hopes of discouraging protests. Some concessions were given, such as increased social spending and a payment of $1,000 to every family being given out by the government, although most members of the opposition didn't feel it was nearly enough. Why the protests failed can largely be attributed to foreign influence. While America and other Western governments had backed protests in Egypt, Libya, and Syria, they had remained silent in Bahrain. Bahrain, being a vital U.S. ally in the region, led to the Americans not backing the protests. Other players in the Gulf also opposed the protests, as states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE all have similar governments to Bahrain, and instead actually chose to send troops into the country to help the Khalifas. Iran was supportive of the protests and likely did try to aid them by shipping supplies and weapons to them, but due to American forces present in the country, were largely unable to fully commit too many resources. Bahrain also saw a lack of media coverage, as many international journalists were barred from entering the country. Local journalists were often just detained and tortured if they did speak out, and the coverage that did come out was often messy and contradictory. Bahrain today still remains similar to how it operated before the protest. Hamad remains king, with his family dominating politics. Opposition parties are present in the country and in elected positions, but usually away from any significant power. A decent chunk of the citizens still remain unemployed, while migrant workers are often underpaid and working under very loose safety regulations. Environmental devastation is also a problem because, as the country grows, more of the underwater reserves present in the country are becoming overused. I should mention that despite all the problems I am bringing up, Bahrain still remains a fairly rich country. It has a GDP per capita higher than France, Saudi Arabia, and Canada, and is one of the fastest growing economies in the Middle East, mainly due to the success of the banking and tourism sectors in the country. Infrastructure and education are improving, and generally the country is well developed. It's just the problem is those benefits are not evenly distributed to everyone. To end it off, Khalifa bin Salman would actually die in November of 2020. He was the longest serving prime minister in world history, with him holding that office for 50 years. Yeah, he never won via election, but that's something he can brag about. Well, could if he was alive. He would be replaced by Salman bin Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa, who is the son of Hamad and heir apparent of the throne. So why does Bahrain exist? Bahrain exists because of geopolitical circumstances surrounding it. The Khalifas had to ally with the British in order to maintain their power, and now ally with the Saudis and Americans to remain. Today, in many ways, the country is shaped by the wishes of the Khalifas. If the Khalifas will continue to rule as an absolute monarchy, will reform to a more constitutional one, or will be removed entirely in the coming years remains to be seen. It'll all depend on the actions of the people of Bahrain, the Khalifas, and the international players surrounding it. Up next, we go east to Bangladesh and South Asia. Prepare for the British, yet again, a massive population, and some tricky borders. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to check out some other podcasts, I would recommend Founders of Nations, Anthology of Heroes, and the Vex podcast. Founders of Nations released an episode talking about Thanksgiving and kind of the history of the traditions of Thanksgiving. So if you want to learn about that, I will have that linked in the description, along with all the other podcasts. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. My email is whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And I think because this will come out on Christmas, if you're listening on Christmas, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. The sources I used for this episode are Al Jazeera's documentary, Bahrain Shouting in the Dark, Caspian Report's video, Bahrain's Strategic Importance, Epimetheus' video, History of the Persian Gulf, Fanak's article, Antiquity to the Industrialization of Al Khalifa's Rule, Geography Now's video, Bahrain, History with Size video, Dil Moon, the Sumerian Shangri-La, Journeyman Pictures documentary, The Brutal Backlash Against the Protest in Bahrain, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Bahrain, Stopover History documentary Discovery, documentary on the Gulf states, Vice News' documentary, The Revolt That Never Went Away, World Bulletin's article on the Cormatians, and Wikipedia.